Thank you, Hannah. Well, again, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. So excited to have night school back in action for DFA. We took a little bit of a break, but going into these midterms, we quickly realized that we needed to bring our online training back. This year, we wanted to have an extra special focus on field, something that we felt like we were seeing the progressive movement get away from, especially with some of the campaigns on the ground. So we wanted to have a chance to reset things and get back to basics on what's always been the bread and butter for how progressive candidates have won. So if you are not familiar with Democracy for America, our organization was started coming out of the Howard Dean campaign. We've been around for 18 years. We've helped elect over 1,100 candidates and also provided over $70 million and contributions, and we're still 1 million members strong. So we are definitely one of the leaders and originals when you think of the progressive movement in today's politics. So with that, I will turn it over to Hannah and Nelson.
Awesome. I'm just going to run through what we're talking about specifically today, and then I'll hand it over to Nelson to talk about how we win progressive campaigns. So we're talking about field, as Chris mentioned. We're talking about win numbers, how to find win numbers. We're talking about contact numbers, how to build a field plan, and what your candidate's field plan might look like. Whether you're a campaign manager, a staffer, a candidate yourself, or you are just volunteering for a campaign, anyone who is around campaigns should have some sort of a grasp of what the field plan looks like and what we're working towards. So I will go ahead and hand it over to Nelson, and he can talk about how we win progressive campaigns and the case studies that we have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hannah and Chris. Welcome to everybody. We are so glad that you are here. And in this conversation, we are really excited about this night school and glad that you are here as we kick it off. As we talk about preparing for field success, looking at kind of what has been what's been happening this year in the field as we've been out there, this topic seemed like it was the most important for us to talk about, especially as we have been seeing so much money that's been poured into campaigns and people trying to figure out how to combat it. We really believe at DFA that field is the way to do that. And so to answer the question about how long we're going to be going, we're hoping we'll be presenting for about between 45 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, and then we'll have time for question and answer at the end. So how do we as progressives win victories? There are two ways. The first is the message, what it is that you are saying to people. Why is your candidate running? Why are people supporting them? What's at stake in the election? And then the math, the people that they are talking to. How many votes do you need? How many people do you need to reach to get there? And how many volunteers do you need to reach the people? These are the foundational building blocks that are needed as we are going through campaigns. We're to talk a little bit about the message. One of the challenges that we have been seeing is that with so much at stake, it's easy to use fear to drive a message. And fear is a powerful motivator. But the challenge with fear is that fear works against our interests. This is from a report published by the American Psychological Association. And in that article, it says, with less than a month to go before the general election, candidates are looking to every available play to influence voting behavior. There were an actual playbook. Fear tactics will occupy prime real estate. Simply put, fear works. And so we see all the time people use fear as a primary motivator in voting. Vote for us because the other person is worse. Vote for us because if you don't, bad things will happen. And fear is used so often. And the challenge is that fear also suppresses votes. From the same article goes on to quote the Journal of Politics and says, if someone is highly anxious about an election or candidate, they may avoid consuming information about the candidate or the election. This may extend to voting abstention because thinking about the election is overly aversive. Raising anxiety around an election or candidate is a tactic often used to decrease voter turnout among an opponent's supporters. We are seeing all over the place legal attacks on voting rights and legal attempts to create voter suppression. What we don't want to do is to contribute to voter suppression by using fear-based messaging. And so it's important as you are crafting your message, as you are reaching out and talking to voters, that you are tapping into people's hopes, that you're tapping into what is possible, that you are connecting with what your candidate can do or will do, or what's possible when the people get together, and how hope can overcome fear in this election and in the progressive movement. And so that message of hope is critically important. And it's really the reason why for the people who are not automatic voters, for people who are less likely to vote, the people who are eager to stay at home, those are the people who need the message of hope. Messages of fear will not bring those voters out. It may rally those people who vote on every election, but it will keep at home people who are not deeply politically engaged. We need messages of hope to tap into those people in order to get them out to vote. And so we'll put a pin in there on the message. We want to move now to talk about win number. How do you calculate that so you know who to talk to? And we're going to walk through this just really quickly, just in case you've never had to do this. But to calculate a win number, you find the total votes in the last 3 comparable elections. You want to think about not only the race that is run, but what are the other races around it. And this is especially true for congressional races this year. You want to think about, you wouldn't want to do 2020 or 2016 because they were presidential elections. So you would want to do, if you're looking at a congressional, you would want to do you'd want to do 18, you'd want to do 14, and you'd want to do 10. You want to do the 3 last comparable elections. And then you take those numbers, and then once you take those, you're going to add them together, and then you'll get a number like you see here on E4 is the sum of them. You'll divide them by 3 because that's the number of elections you used. You'll take that number, that's the average voter turnout of those elections. You want to take that and multiply it by 1.1, or basically add a 10% bump, assuming that 10% more people will be engaged in this election than the average of the last 3, and then divide that number or multiply that number by 0.52, essentially giving yourself a little bit more than 50%. Than 51% to determine your win number. It gives you just a little bit of cushion. You'd be surprised how often people are guessing at win numbers, but you really want to take the time, do the math, figure out the win number based on the last 3 elections. Once you get that win number ought to be driving your contact number. And so when you think about when you're creating a field plan to decide how many people do we need to reach out to, don't use round numbers that sound great. Saying, we're going to knock on 10,000 or 50,000 or 100,000 doors and then stop there. Know what your contact number is based on your win number. And that's essentially multiplying your win number by 10. You're going to take the number of votes that you need to win, in this case, 11,708, multiply that by 10, so that's 117,080. And that's the amount of people that you need to contact in order to be able to arrive at your win number. As you're thinking about that, here are some other numbers that will help you as you're deciding how you contact people. Number one, your answer on door rates during peak time, which is late afternoon, early evening, between typically 5:30 and 8 local time, or your peak hours. Your answer rate on the doors between those peak hours is going to be between 20% and 25%, which means between 1 out of 4 and 1 out of 5 people are going to answer the door. The reason why we keep that contact number is so high is because most of the people you are reaching out to aren't going to even answer the door. The people who answer the door, all of them are not going to support your candidate right away. And so in order to be able to effectively get to the win number, we need to plan to contact many more people. So between 20 and 25% is your typical answer rate on doors. On phones, between peak time, it's going to be between 15% and 20%. And texting is between 8 and 10%. I know it's often easier to get people to pick up a phone and call than it is to get them to knock on doors. And it's much easier to get people to volunteer to text than it is to do phones or doors. But as you are talking with people, especially people who are committed to your campaign, letting them know the reason why we want you to get on phones instead of just text messaging, or the reason why we want you to go knock on doors instead of being on phones, is because it is significantly more effective. We are going to reach more people. We are going to have a bigger impact. And so if you'd be willing to take the next step, even if it's a little uncomfortable, the data shows this is much more effective. Being willing and able to share this with people can help move them along in terms of their engagement in campaigns. So I'm going to pass it over to Hannah, who's going to talk about how we build the universe.
Thank you, Nelson. So there are a couple of different ways you can build universes. They're all displayed here. There is the geographical way to build a universe. Generally, neighborhoods tend to think alike. If you know that your candidate or the issue that you're working towards has an advantage in a certain neighborhood or a certain area of town, that's certainly something that you can take into account when building your field plan. You can also build a universe by demographics or identities. So that is not just ethnically, racially, gender-based, but it's also, what job do you have? Do you have kids? What's your socioeconomic status? So that kind of the identities that people hold tend to affect the way that they vote a lot. So if you know that your candidate is a teacher and she is a single mom, you can target people who have those similar identities, and those people are more likely to support your candidate or volunteer for your candidate than people that don't share those identities. This is speaking very generally. You can also target based on voter history. This is a solid way to do targeting. You can, just like Nelson was talking about, there are comparable elections every year. So if you're running in an odd year with a municipal election, you can target people who have voted in every municipal election. You can target people who have never voted in a municipal election, but just recently registered. So voting history is a really popular way to target, and DFA targets based on voter history as well as demographics. We target based on voter history because we want to talk to the people that campaigns may not have the resources to talk to. So that's people that aren't within that super voter block of people that vote in every election, that have volunteered for other elections, that are donors. They're people that campaigns just don't necessarily have the resources to talk to. You can also target based on modeling. If you are on a campaign, if you're a campaign staffer, you might have access to a database like NGP Van. You might have access to something like L2 or like PDI. And those different services can provide targeting modeling that is based on a lot of different things. They also tap into different targeting and modeling done by like the DCCC or the DSCC or even other organizations or campaigns who pay to do polling and targeting. But you can use, these are not silos. You can and should use all of them in order to create a robust and smart data-based universe. But all of your targeting should be a constant feedback loop. We talk about polling. Polling is sometimes inaccessible for campaigns just because of how much it costs, and also it's not always reliable. But if you ask any organizer in 2016 what they thought would happen, then any organizer on the ground who was knocking doors could have told you what was going to happen. So make sure you're paying attention to the volunteers who are on the ground, what they're telling you, your organizers who are talking to voters every day, those people that have those voter contacts and have a real, they know what the community is thinking. And that's why it's also important to have community leaders on your team who know different populations within your community and know and hear feedback from those populations. When you're talking about how you're contacting your candidate or your universe, this is a very simple crosstab that gives you a little bit of an idea on how to mobilize different parts of your universe. So you can see this supporters and frequent voters base. Those people are going to vote, and they're probably going to vote for you. They probably need a touch from you. They probably need just a reminder that there's an election, a reminder that you are the candidate for the party that they're voting for. But they are also going to be the place where you're going to do the most base building. They're going to be the leaders of your volunteer groups. They're going to be people who knock your doors, do phone calls for you, and people that you look to for donations and funding support as well. So that is your bread and butter. Those are the people that you're engaging early so that they can be involved in the campaign, and then you're engaging them again late so that they remember to vote. The people that are in this yellow section, they take a little bit more work. Those people need to see what your ID looks like. So they need to see what your candidate or your issue looks like. They need that extra bio piece, and then they might need some persuasion, and they definitely need some get out the vote. So unless they're a frequent voter. So you need to talk to them a couple times throughout your campaign, really give them a good bio from your candidate. You can tailor that message depending on what identities that person holds in that community. And you can also do persuasion, and anyone who says that they are likely to vote for your candidate, leaning towards voting for your candidate, those are the people that you also want to remind to vote. And then these people down here in the orange section, we don't like to exclude those at DFA because they could be newly registered voters. They could be people who feel disillusioned with the system and they just need an excuse to go out and vote. They need an inspiring candidate to go out and vote. You definitely want to try to landscape those people and determine what has been keeping them from the polls. If they don't live close to a polling location, if they've historically been excluded from this kind of civic action, this is the people that you really need to take a deeper look at. And that is what DFA does when we do targeting. And then these people over here that are your strong opponent, you don't really want to talk to those people. You don't want to remind them to go out and vote because they're going to vote against you. All right, I'm going to turn it. Oh, just kidding. Still me. So now we will move into how to use these win and contact numbers. So you have your universe, you have your win number, you have your contact number. You're going to use all of those things to build a data-based intelligent field plan. So the first thing you're going to do is determine what your staff and volunteer needs are. I would start with your staff. You know how many people are on your team. You have kind of a plan for the whole cycle to see how many people will be on your team and when you're going to onboard those people. And those staffers are going to knock a little bit faster than your volunteers. They're more experienced. They have faster conversations on the doors, and they're also used to walking a lot because that's their job. So you want to start with those people, you know how many hours roughly you have. And then using that formula of 18 to 20 doors per hour or 12 to 15 doors per hour for volunteers, you're going to take this number, the staff hours number, and subtract it from the total number of hours that you need. So that the total number of hours you need is going to be your contact number divided by the average number of doors that you're knocking. So you're going to subtract your staff hours from that, and then you see how many doors you have left. You know how many volunteers you need between now and election day. So you can take that and you can look at how many weeks you have left. So say we have 20 weeks left, we need 20,000-ish volunteers. That's 1,000 volunteers a week. So how are you going to shift 1,000 volunteer hours a week? So how are you going to shift those out? Are they going to be 3-hour shifts per volunteer? How many shifts per week are you going to do? What does that look like for your field plan so that you know that you're knocking on enough doors? And there's the point of having a good field plan is so that there's no uncertainty between now and the election. You should know exactly where your votes are coming from. You should know exactly what doors you've knocked on, and that those people are people that you need to turn out to vote. And this applies also for phone calls and texts. So you can do the same method with phone calls and texts. Another way to use this number is to set goals and targets. You always want to make sure you want to be checking in with your team. You want to be checking in with your organizers and your endorsers and the people around you. And you want to set goals for yourself. 80 days out, we always want to have 80% of our win number. That's a pretty good goal that everyone should have. As you're knocking these doors and doing these phone calls, you're getting IDs for people. So that means you're asking the pointed question, hey, can my candidate count on your vote? And how are you going to vote? And every person that you can count on, that person will go in your system as a positive ID. So you're trying to get to 80% of that win number with positive IDs by 30 days out, especially if early vote is starting 30 days out. Always look at early vote. You can also use these goals to encourage your staff and your volunteers. I've seen big thermometers in offices before that shows you how far away you are from your door knocking goal or your phone calling goal or your ID goal. That's a really inspiring thing to do. You can also know based on your regular check-ins and based on your goals, how close to your goal you are. And it can give you an idea of if you need to change some things up. If you're seeing that you're falling short, if that means you need to divert some of your funds from TV to organizers or from digital to organizers so that you make sure that you're on the ground and knocking doors, then that's something that you have to weigh. You should know during weekly updates with your team or during updates with any of your endorsers or any organizations that you're working with, there should be a good amount of feedback on those goals and people letting you know that if your goal is too conservative or if it's too much of a reach for you, it just gives you an idea of where you're at in the campaign and what you can be counting on for the future. And the last way, one of many, the last one we're covering today, is to make better and clearer asks. So instead of asking an elected official to send an email to their list, you ask them to send an email to your list of 1,000 people. Can you contact 1,000 people for me? Or 10,000 people or 20,000 people. You can also use that for volunteers. You can ask volunteers to ID 50 supporters by election day. You can ask them to bring 100 people to their house for a meet and greet. Be very specific with the things that you're asking for, because those all will feed in to your win number and your contact goal. You can also use it to ask donors for a specific amount of money. This is a really good way to connect donors with what you're doing on the campaign. A lot of times campaigns will ask for $1,000 and they don't let a donor know what that money is going towards. But we can see the line between $1,000 and 1,000 text messages or 10,000 text messages. So let them know what their money is going towards, and that will help contextualize what they're spending their money on, and will help you in your fundraising as well. All right. I am going to hand it over to Nelson really quick to do a case study, and then we'll go back to Chris.
So I know it's easy to look at information like this and think, these people are sitting in offices and not out here in the field. And so what they're talking about isn't applicable to our situation. So I wanted to share with you a real live case study from this year where this has worked, where we have seen this work. and that was in Texas. Greg Casar is running for Congress in Texas, and his district covered part of Austin, Texas, most of Austin, Texas, and a part of San Antonio. And when we endorsed Greg and started talking with his team, we looked at their plan, and they had an incredibly aggressive field plan where they were doing high levels of contact. They diverted most of their resources into their ground game, and so their field staff was particularly robust, which means they had less money for mail and less money for ads. But their emphasis was on their field, was on their side of the field. And so when we sat down and said, how can we help? What is it that we can do to be a value add? They asked for two things. One, they said that most of their work was in Austin. That was the largest portion of their district. So could we prioritize San Antonio for our outreach as we were preparing our text messaging campaign to help supplement their field program? They said, can you focus on San Antonio because most of our work is in Austin? And then secondly, as you are for the people who you are texting in Austin, can you let us know how effective our field message is so that we want to make sure people know that they're hearing about us, that they're knowing what we are about and what we are doing, and seeing how much that is reaching people. So that by the time we got finished, we did 3 passes of our texting program for them. And by the time we got down there and were on the ground with them, we were able to share with them that close to 70% of the people we texted had heard about the campaign and were voting for them. Which was by far, of any of the candidates in that cycle, it was the highest by a long shot of anybody of support that we've seen for a candidate. And we believe that that is highly attributable to the fact that they invested so much in their knowing their numbers, knowing what their win number was, knowing what their contact number was, and using that to gauge their hiring. So they hired a field staff that would go out and get that contact number. Then when we got on the ground and we started going out with their field team to go knock on doors, they gave us a list. Every person whose door we knocked on was somebody that they had already talked to. They already knew this person was supporting them. And so we weren't doing any persuasion in the weekend leading up to Election Day. We were doing all turnout. So everybody we were talking to was a supporter. And so we were telling them, you can go out and vote. And in fact, the first night we went out there, the poll was open until 10 o'clock that night. And so myself and our CEO and the candidate went out, and we were knocking on doors until close to 9:30 in the neighborhood around the early vote site to tell people you can go right now, go down the street and you can vote. We'll have somebody pick you up. We had an elderly woman who wanted to vote, and the campaign manager got in his car and drove and picked her up and drove her to the polls so she could vote. But all of that, all of our efforts then were just about turning out the people that needed to vote. And if you paid attention to the Texas primary, you'll see of the races that people were watching, Greg's race was the one race that did not go to a runoff. That race, he won that outright and won it in convincing fashion because he put emphasis on developing a field plan and then executing it day in and day out When it was raining, when it was cold, they were still out there knocking doors because they knew their numbers and they were committed to getting those numbers. So I want to turn it over now to Chris to wrap up our presentation.
Thanks, Nelson. So the part I'm going to go into is just sticking to the plan. Sometimes the staff likes to joke. Often if I have to come in a conversation, usually it's going to be a very truthful conversation with both the candidate and who's running the campaign about what needs to actually get done. I've seen too many times when you get that October surprise or just the general surprise that you get right before election, everything gets abandoned. And the first thing that gets abandoned is field. Oh, we got to put more money on TV. Oh, we got to put more money on digital. And you forget at the end of the day, a lot of times our progressive candidates are not going to raise more money. We're not going to be able to dump more money into ads. And our antidote has always been when we've been able to reach more people on the ground. I cannot tell you how many times this year that we've been on the ground and I've been with the candidate and we're sitting there and we're talking about the fear-mongering ads that they just got hit with. And my first question is, well, what was your response? How did your team respond to it? What was your message on the doors to it? And a lot of times they can't answer that question, but sometimes they can. And the ones, a lot of the wins that we've had, and we've had 63 so far through the primary season, know that answer and can say it without hesitation to me. And so when we're looking at these things, we encourage all of our candidates to make sure that they're running a proactive campaign, not a reactive campaign, that they're running a campaign that's based in data-driven organizing. When you get hit with an ad, go back to the basics. See it come in slow and go back to the basics. A lot of times you have a lot more time to respond, whether or not you're volunteering for a campaign, whether or not you're a staffer, whether or not you're a candidate, you have more time to respond a lot of times than what we put the sense of urgency and fear within ourselves in these situations. Another big thing for us, and that we tell a lot of candidates, so if you're staff, if you're a candidate on here, don't hide your numbers. Just because you didn't hit your number doesn't mean that you have to be ashamed of that. But as a national partner that likes to be very invested, especially in the field thing, we cannot help you coming down the stretch if we don't know what you're actually dealing with. Again, not to single out any particular candidate, but we've definitely been on the ground at times where we got there, and by that time, oftentimes it's too late. We're 2 weeks, 1 week out. We can do as much as we can to try to reach voters, but a lot of time the damage has been done. So being upfront with where you are with your numbers is extremely helpful. I want to go back to, again, coming out post-COVID. I know we put a lot in digital. I know even some of our local chapters, you may be thinking about running digital ads for some of your candidates. The way that digital is most effective is when you still use a data-driven organizing approach. If I can double up who I'm trying to contact on the door and hit them with a digital ad and they're getting 2 touches of communication, that is 10 times more effective than them just seeing a continuous ad that's running on Facebook or on Instagram. So again, it goes back to having that data-driven organizing mindset in the first place. So again, a couple of things that I want you to take away. Chaos is always going to happen on a campaign. How you respond to chaos, either one, if you can predict it, that's great. If you can't, being set in your core values and how you want to run your campaign will help you quickly be able to avert any chaos that comes down that campaign. I want to say to everybody, again, and this is more for candidates and campaigners, but lean on your partners, lean on your endorsers. We are here to help you. And I think a lot of times people think of that we have PAC in our name, and so you just automatically equate it to money. But there's so many different ways that PACs operate. And our number one thing is, yeah, we could cut you a check, but how quickly you can spend that check versus us sitting down week to week or even bi-weekly with you, us being able to send some of our amazing volunteers to you to be able to text, to be able to call. What we can put in an investment in the field is going to go so much further than just simply cutting a $2,500 or $5,000 check to a candidate and campaign. The thing about progressive candidates is our candidates oftentimes have the winning message. They have the winning story. They have that story that connects with everybody on the ground. All of you that volunteer and engage with these campaigns, you know it because you were inspired a lot of times to come work for that candidate. And so a lot of times you're putting in harder work because you love that candidate on top of, yes, we don't want the GOP in control, but our candidates have oftentimes that message that relates to the people. But sometimes we can get away with that and we can go for the viral moment and forget that it's the kitchen table issues that connect with the voters every single day. And if we keep plugging in that story and we keep that at the centerfold and we keep the fact that we have to have direct voter engagement and not just a viral moment, we won't lose. We will not lose 9 times out of 10. But when we get away with that, a lot of times, and we try to do something that's not our bread and butter, when we get into the spending game that we know we can't outspend, we're going to lose because now we're not playing at our own game. And the last thing I'll leave you with, we've seen so much dark money, so much IE spending this year. What I will say, we've lost some tough races and we've won some incredible ones. You look at Maxwell Frost, you look at Summer Lee, you look at Greg Cassar, just to name a few, Delia Ramirez. When we stick to making sure we are still hitting those doors, despite how much money comes in, we will still win more times than not. You look at the month of May, you look at somebody like Summer Lee, over $4 million poured into her race. Talking to her when she was in DC afterwards, one of the things she said is, we just kept pounding the pavement. And the funny thing was, the more that they went out, people talked about how, one, because they had seen her so much, they knew it couldn't be true because this woman shows up every single day to their doors in their neighborhoods when nobody else had even tried to talk to them. So a lot that happened was they increased her name recognition in places where she wasn't as well known. So then when she came to the door, they had already heard about her so much. So again, pounding the pavement, sticking to the basics, sticking to our core, that is always going to be the greatest way that we can win, no matter what time in an election. But again, don't wait till the last minute. If you are struggling to hit those numbers, be honest about where your program is, but never abandon field for anything else. And then I think I'm turning it back over to Hannah.
All right. We are in the question and answer portion of the evening. So if you have any questions, you can either put them in the chat. I'll go back through and see if there are any that we can answer, or you can raise your hand and I will call on you whenever, but in the order that you ask. A couple of you asked about recordings. We are recording this now and it will be available to you after the session. All right, it looks like.
Hannah, can you go to slide number 8? I think
And then I'm gonna start with Susan. That's the one that's on the top of our queue, and then we have a couple other written down. So we'll go through the messages or the questions. So Susan asked, what is our messaging around inflation? Do congressional progressive candidates talk about Biden? I think what we are seeing at this point in the year is a lot of our progressive candidates, while they are still strong on making sure that we hold President Biden accountable and make sure that he is pushing for the things, the way that Ayanna Pressley often likes to say, pushing to have policies and action that help the people that are closest to the pain. So our candidates, progressive candidates, have been talking that. I think what you have seen a little bit more is a little bit more of a coalition on the Democratic side as we get closer to the election. So there is still, yes, we have to be accountable. We have to push for more. We know we can get more, but also this is what we have been able to see pass in the administration so far. So it's more of an and also message versus just firing shots at the president. So Susan, I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but that's a lot of what's going on right now, particularly at the federal level. I know we had another question earlier. How can you bring in specific number of supporters? You may encounter a large number of people that are lukewarm. The funny thing enough is, well, it's a kind of a twofold thing. One, I think when you're talking about lukewarm people, you're talking about how much time do you have to really continue to talk to them. I know Nelson is a huge fan of the deep canvassing and having the deeper conversations, but that's something a lot of times for candidates and campaigns, a lot of that has to happen during those spring and the summer months. And as we get closer to the fall, it's a little bit quicker. But again, what I would say is maximize all your resources. I think the first thing in it, beyond just connecting with those people that fall in love with your campaign right away, that you identified as ones and twos, that number one should be your first go-to of who you're asking to volunteer on your campaign down the home stretch. But then when you're looking at people, maybe you have a local school board member that endorse you. Maybe you have precinct captains that endorse you. A lot of times people don't fully utilize the people that have endorsed in these races and look through the full spreadsheet of who's endorsed them to look on who else can they actually call on. So sometimes it's calling the endorsers that you had, and sometimes it's making a specific ask of them reaching into their network as well to pull into volunteers for you. And the last thing I would say, which I'm always a huge fan of, I've done a number of times and it's been hugely successful. Start a fellowship program, start an internship program. We definitely encourage you to find a way to compensate your interns or your fellows for the work that they're doing. But a lot of times, young people, whether or not they're at the college level, whether or not they're at the high school level, a lot of times you would be surprised how many campaigns overlook making those ads. To add a quick story, my first campaign that I did during President Obama's reelection campaign in 2012, we had an internship program because the local high schools in Cincinnati, actually, a lot of them required students to have civic participation for some of their classes. And that was a way for them to get engaged. So we were able to tap into that. But part of that happened because we were just willing to also just talk to the schools and find out what was being offered and how could we get people involved. And for a lot of those folks, it's transformational. I remember some of those interns have now gone on to be bigger staffers because they stuck with it, because that campaign transformed them, but that was their first exposure. So I hope that answers that question for whoever asked earlier.
I wanted to add just one thing to that, Chris. As you look at this slide here, where we're taking our hypothetical win number and then the contact number that's based on that. Go back to the slide 11, please. Yeah, so then what I've done here is calculated based on that. What would it take for staff hours to cover that whole contact number to get us to the win number? And then what would the same number look like for volunteer hours? But as you are building out your plan, the number of staff hours you have will reduce the number of volunteer hours that you need in order to get to that goal. So those two numbers, number one, will be in conversation with each other and will impact each other. And then based on the number of volunteer hours you need, you should set your target for how many volunteers you need to bring in to get those many volunteer hours. So that's the first thing. I know in campaigns, our numbers are often closely held secrets. I am a huge supporter of taking these numbers, the number of voters we need to win, the number of contacts we need, and the number of volunteer hours we need based on that, of sharing that with people that you want to be a part of the team, to bring them in by sharing, this is what we need. We need you to be a part of a team that's helping us to reach this goal. And that gives someone something specific to hold on to, but also it helps them feel like they are a part of a team that is moving towards something. The second thing is we're going to talk next week about how we do this exact thing. How do we talk to people who could be volunteers in a way to quickly get deep with them to bring them in. And so we'll be talking about that. We want to be able to do this really, really quickly and really effectively. So we're going to talk about how do we bring them in so that they can, in a short span of time, we don't have 30 or 40 minutes to talk to every volunteer, but how do we get that conversation deep quickly to help engage people and bring them into the campaign? So come back next week so we can dig more into that.
We had a question that was submitted ahead of time, and then Carlos, I know you had your hand up, and we'll come to you for the final question of the night. Somebody.
I didn't have a question. I accidentally hit a button.
Oh, okay. All right. Thanks.
I'm just trying to learn what you guys are doing here.
Got it. Thanks.
Huh?
So the question that we had submitted through our portal, how can you overcome negativity in the division of classes with messaging? The biggest thing about negativity, and it sounds so cliche, but you just respond to with a positive message. You would be very surprised, but a lot of times when we are on the doors, when we're talking to voters online, even having text message conversations with voters, a lot of them are tired of the negative and the fearful messaging. But the biggest way to bounce back is talk about the positive ways that you want to impact the community, the positive ways that you want to make their life better. Bring it back to the point. And I think that's what progressives a lot of times when we're doing it best is centering back on that message of hope. and making people want to actually believe in politics because you have somebody that wants to fight for them. A lot of times the negative messages that we're going to get, the division with classes, still come back to kitchen table bread and butter issues. And so our candidates perform the best, and even as a volunteer, knowing your candidate, when you influence and you inject that message with hope, when you inject that message with what you're fighting for, not what you're fighting against, you will see a significant change in that. I think the biggest mistake I've seen candidates do is be able to take something that should have been a strength for them, allow it to become a fear and a negative for them. But being willing to lean into what you know you're strong with, what your record is, what you are fighting for. When you do that and you know that and you stay on brand with that message, nobody can push you off of that.
So, Lydia, to your question about volunteer hours, that is a huge amount of volunteer hours. The those hours are based on kind of a medium of door knocking, calling, and texting. And what you should do as you are thinking about that is really take the next step and breaking down if we have if we get 100 hours, 1,000 hours, 10,000 hours, depending on the size of people you are trying to reach. If we have these many hours on doors, knowing that the contact rate is 25%, if we have 10,000 volunteer hours on doors, we know that we are likely to reach X number of people, and then X number of people is going to contribute Y number of supporters. And so this is what we are expecting as the payout from this. And do the same for phones and do the same for text messages. So that way what you are asking people to volunteer for to fill is broken out specifically to address what you need. And then also, again, use that to help encourage people. You know, we've got so many people texting. We've got more than enough texters. What we really need is somebody to hop on a phone. Will you be willing to be that person? You've been so great at texting. Would you be willing to try hopping on a phone? And using those as invitations to help bring people along. What Lynn is saying is exactly right. Connecting with college students for volunteer hours and internship helps also. It is a great way reaching out to people, reaching out to college classes, political science classes, to let people know of opportunities that exist. Is a great way to get people to come in and fill some of those volunteer hours. And I also want to be very clear that I am saying volunteer hours and not volunteer shifts. Don't think that you need that number of volunteer shifts, but hopefully each of your shifts is at least 2 hours. And so people are volunteering for 2 hours at a time. And so that will help to decrease the number of hours more quickly as you're thinking about that.
And Nelson, I just want to add one more thing, and particularly I make this as a declarative statement, but also an ask to everybody on here. When you have a lot of these elections, but particularly in midterm and presidential years, being able to break it down and making it seem achievable, because I know a lot of times people hear the word volunteer and they get a little bit scared. Like you think it's this overbearing time commitment, but a lot of times what I've seen as most effective and what's even been most effective For me, it's asking them, look, like we have this many Saturdays, this many weekends until election day. Can you find 1 to 2 hours between that time? Can I get you to give me 1 to 2 hours to do your part to make sure the candidate that you believe in wins? If you already said you're supporting them, just give me 1 to 2 hours. And the key with that is if I can get you to commit to that first 1 to 2, I can possibly get you for more. And if I don't, I still got the 1 to 2. But I think a lot of times people hear the shift time and it's like, oh, this 3 hours on a Saturday, I can't commit to that. I got to do this with the kids, or I got this with the family. Breaking it down to something that seems achievable, even more achievable for people work. And so the ask that will be brought up in every one of these sessions, and then you'll probably get an email from us about it, is definitely for supporters of DFA, because we know you also love our candidates, but you know what's at stake in this midterm. When we start pushing out volunteer shifts, find something that you can commit to and give us at least 1 to 2 hours before this election is over. If you can do more, that's great. But just as much as we need grassroots donations to help fund our work, we also need people power to help fund our work and investment in our candidates that way as well.
Yeah.
Awesome. Any other questions from anybody before we wrap up? Awesome. Do we have any DFA endorsed candidate staff on the call? I don't think I saw any candidates on the call, but any staff? Okay, great. Any final thoughts, Chris or Nelson, before we log off for the night?
I just want to say thank you all for being here. If you are actively working on a campaign and you have not created a win number or your contact number, do that tonight. Make that your homework tonight. Don't go to bed without having a win number and a contact number, so that you are using that to help guide your campaign moving forward. And the rest of what we talk about over the next 3 weeks is going to be how we take this number and then operationalize it. How do we help recruit volunteers when we know how many we need? How do we use the numbers as milestones to help generate energy and motivation? How do we talk about this with others? How do we make asks of other campaigns, of endorsers, of people others who say they want to help? How do we use this as a way to help make all of those conversations more fruitful and more productive? So get this number down. If you have questions with your win number, reach out and we will help you look at your win number to make sure it's right.
Thank you all so much for joining.